Hello. Today, I am doing a voiceover for this illustration that I did of a, demon painting her nails in her room. I had to do a bit of investigating on this one because I couldn't remember, when I made it or how long it took. So I created the Procreate file December 20th of 2020. And then I had to go to my Instagram to see when I posted it so I could figure out around the time I finished it, and it was February 11th, 2021. So this one did take a bit of time. I think I went a few weeks without even touching it or even drawing at all, which happens sometimes. I'll go weeks or a few months without, drawing anything. And I don't want to pretend like I don't do that because I do a lot. So if you do that, you're definitely not alone. This one did take a while, and I think it was because I was kind of not really sure what I wanted any of my final illustrations to look like at this point. I was really struggling with how to make something look finished and polished in a way that I really wanted it to. So in this one I used a completely new line art brush that didn't really have a sort of varying line width. With Procreate, you can have pressure sensitive brushes, and this one was just a straight sort of pen line art round brush that was relatively thin, and I added a bit of grain to it to give it an interesting texture, but other than that, any of the line width in the piece was entirely very intentionally put there. And I also did a lot of rounded corners and sort of some of the darkest parts of the drawing I sort of made into a shadow as the same color as the line art to sort of make a lot of varying line widths and give it some more dimension. I think the entire piece as a whole, if I remember correctly, took around 14 hours and 11 minutes. So they don't take as long as they did before, the vampire one that took 20 hours. But I was still sort of, since I didn't work on it for such long gaps, I was sort of trying to pick it back up and figure out where I was and sort of grasping at straws. But I do really like the way that it turned out in the end. I really like sort of the color palette that turned out. I like the perspective, the bed and the carpet. I think it really gives it a dynamic sort of look. I do think the bookcase and the table in the background look a little bit flat and kind of don't make sense because why is the bedside table so far away from the edge of the bed? But that's because she's sitting there and it would be hiding behind her, so I moved it or had it right there. So little things like that sort of make it flat, but I think that's sort of what I was, again, I'm trying to figure out what my thought process was a year ago. Not a year ago, what was it? It's September now. 9 months ago? December. Yeah, sort of 8-9 months ago. I'm trying to figure out what my thought process was, which is difficult because I can't even figure out what I was thinking last week. But I think I was trying to sort of I'm always doing this, trying to balance sort of a dynamic cartoony style versus realism and rendering and things like that, because I can't really render in digital art and don't really like it. The same thing with when I was learning how to paint with oil paint, I really didn't like blending, or like how that sort of turned out. Whenever I loved it, when other people did it, but I never really liked it when I did it. And so I think that's sort of what I was playing with this, because like obviously like I'm very intentional with like the perspective looks realistic, and like the folds and the clothes and things like that. But at the same time, like if you sort of look at her proportions and the way that she's sitting, she looks kind of like flat, especially sort of like the way that her arm is positioned and things like that. And then, like a couple of things, like especially when I get into like the line art and the color, it sort of ends up looking like flat and cartoony. But I think I sort of balanced those two things pretty well in this one. I think my artwork currently has a bit more like, and then here's me like trying to figure out what the color palette is, which I think is a really fun part about the process, especially when like I'm playing with a bunch of different bright colors. One thing that I've noticed that I do currently is I work with a lot more like muted and desaturated colors than like I'm doing right here. But then I add a lot of color when I get into like the lighting. I always add, in like my last like 5 or 6 illustrations that I've done, I've added like a color dodge layer that's like a gradient that like makes it super saturated, but then like in the areas that the lighting are supposed to be, those are more saturated, and then in the areas of shadow, like they're like a bit more subtler. And so I feel like my lighting currently is a lot more realistic than it is in any of these past drawings. And you can sort of see like where like the line art is incredibly flat, but where I'm sort of adding those like areas of like shadow and like the rounded corners, especially on like the plant and like the camera there and the bookcase and things like that. I really like doing things like this where it's just sort of like really tiny points of detail. It's just sort of like calming, I guess. Like a bit sort of like, what's the word, monotone? No. Monotonous? Yes, monotonous work. And you can see sort of where I add the shadow, like in between like the books that are over there. And like on like the little wrinkles. Yeah, I believe the pen that I used is just the pen brush, or like it's just a round brush with like no pressure sensitivity, and then I added a texture to it. And then like, you can change the minimum or maximum width depending on like how big your piece is and like how big you want the brush to be in comparison to it. And so, yeah, if you like the look of like a flat brush, but then you want to add something that's more dynamic to it, adding sort of like those like areas of like the dark shadow with the line art brush really helps with that. Yeah, and I think the color palette here as well definitely I think is sort of what I was trying to do with the Frankenstein piece, but then ultimately failed at, because the Frankenstein piece sort of ended up looking muddy, but then this one, has all of these different colors of like greenish and like bluish and purple, and then like the sort of like red and pink salmon colors, but they all ended up sort of blending together really well, I think, and like making your eye travel throughout the piece, because when the piece is so busy, adding like different areas of color in different places sort of helps the eye travel around it. Like how like good design is supposed to be, like you're supposed to like have like a main thing and then like have your eye travel throughout it. But yeah, if you're not quite wondering, like, if you're like trying to struggle and like figure out all of the different color palettes, then just like sort of do what I did and like just like add sort of blobs of color and not like be like super tedious with like coloring it in. And so this is me just being like, oh, if this color goes here, how will it look? And then when I figure that out, I like redo it and like clean it up, and then it'll look more intentional if you do it like that. Yeah. I think this one looks a lot different than any of the other pieces that I've made. But I do kind of want to try and bring back sort of like the cartoony color pop feel of this one, because I just think like if you like look at like the messy bed and sort of like all of the little lines on it, I think that is sort of something that I want to bring back. And in this one, similar to my other ones, I didn't really like have an idea for like the shadow or anything like that. I don't think like the lighting in the shadow is the best, but with this one, I think it looks a lot better because it's like supposed to be very flat and like color poppy. I'm not sure if that makes sense, but I do have 2 layers of like shadow, like a lighter one and then like a darker one on top of it. I also used a couple gradients like on the carpet and on the wall, and then I added a just general like noise gradient over it to give it some texture. And that's pretty much it. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you have a wonderful day. Thank you so much for watching. Bye bye.